Welcome to Pretty Lies and Alibis. Let's seek the truth and travel the long road to justice together. What you know, Alibiers. Hope you've had a great weekend. Welcome to another episode of Pretty Lies and Alibis. I'm Gigi, and gearing up for a busy week. So tomorrow we have closings in the George Wagner trial. The plan for tomorrow is to do an episode recapping those closings, and then hopefully tomorrow evening around 8 or 8:30 go live with Biggie and Jamie, both of which have been in the courtroom throughout this trial taking notes to give us all the testimony when somebody is opted out, and also maybe see if anybody else wants to hop on. Maybe Anjanette. We'll see what happens, but it's going to be a very interesting week. Let's see how fast maybe this verdict comes back, or, you know, if it goes on a little longer, then it's going to be interesting to see what happens. So join us for that. Also, music fact of the day before I get started. Reba McEntire. I've been on a big 90s country music kick lately. I love 90s music. And so Reba was a big part of that for me. Love Fancy. That's one of my favorite songs that came out of the late 80s, early 90s. But she is the only country female solo artist to have a #1 hit in 4 straight decades, starting in the 80s, 90s, 2000s, and the 10s. So an interesting little tidbit about Reba as well. She's a great actress. She's definitely multi-talented, but she was actually chosen by James Cameron to play the unsinkable Molly Brown in Titanic, but she had to decline because of her tour schedule. And as we know, that role went on to the amazing Kathy Bates, who I love. Everything she does is perfect. And I especially love her in the American Horror Story series. You really see her amazing range. All those actors on that series are mind-blowing. All right, so the Skelton brothers. This cold case is 12 years old now. Just recently, they were last seen Thanksgiving 2010 at their father's house over Thanksgiving break. So I really have wanted for a while to start doing some cold cases because, you know, in the initial days and weeks when somebody goes missing, we're flooded with the media of stories, updates, things like that. And then as time goes on, they get less frequent. And unfortunately, a lot of these cases go to the back of our mind until you see a little something here and there, which the Skelton brothers, I always see something once a year around Thanksgiving, just reminding the public that this case is still unsolved. So let's talk about these boys. Andrew was 9 when he went missing. Alexander was 7 and Tanner was 5. They disappeared Thanksgiving Day, 2010. The boys now would be 21, 19, and 17. Just it's crazy to think that. I remember the day this hit the mainstream media way back then. They were staying with their father, John Skelton, who was divorced from their mother, Tanya, and they were last seen playing in his backyard in Moranci, Michigan. And Moranci borders with Ohio, so it's just right there on the line. And just a little backstory on these parents. And so in 1998, Tanya had pled guilty to 4th-degree criminal sexual conduct, where she was accused of sexual relations with a 14-year-old boy who worked for her and her then husband at their rental properties. And so after the charges, her husband filed for divorce. They had 2 daughters, and she actually took a plea deal in that case. So John and Tanya were married in 2002. And according to Tanya, when they started dating, he knew about the previous charges she had and still chose to be with her. So after their marriage, just a year later in 2003, they filed for bankruptcy. That was dismissed later that year. In 2009, John did some jail time for not paying child support to his daughter from his previous marriage. So both had been married before and had kids. By the fall of 2010, John was out of work and the marriage ended with Tanya. He lost custody of the brothers, and she said his job as a long-haul trucker kept him away from home for long periods at a time. And in the divorce proceedings, Tanya asked for alimony and child support. So the day Tanya filed for divorce, John picked up the boys from school and later fled with them to Florida unlawfully. He said to visit his parents, but after some urging, he returned the boys back to Michigan. This was actually 2 months before the boys disappeared. And in spite of leaving the state with the boys, he was still able to have visitation with them. And it was an agreement that he and Tanya had worked out amongst themselves. So the judge in the case at the time, Margaret Noe, noted that that agreement came with no assistance or intervention from her. And so I'm sure that's something that bothers her to this day, but there were no issues after that Florida incident with the boys up until Thanksgiving when they disappeared. So on September 27th of 2010, John filed for custody of the boys, saying that their mother was a registered sex offender and he thought she was abusing their sons. He didn't get custody, but as we know, he was still scheduled to have his visitation with them over Thanksgiving Day. So the boys were last seen in his backyard on Thanksgiving Day. Actually, he had them for a few days before and after Thanksgiving. Later on, years down the road, John said that the night of Thanksgiving was spent with him making their favorite food, which was fried chicken and a homemade cake for Andrew's birthday. The leftover cake was actually seen in the house when police and investigators went inside after the boys were missing. So when Tanya didn't hear from John on the 26th, which was the day he was supposed to give the boys back to her, she went to his house, but he wasn't there. She eventually made contact with John, and he said he was in the hospital with a broken ankle. He had told staff at the hospital that the broken ankle came from an attempt to take his own life by hanging. And so also, Tanya became worried when she checked his Facebook page and saw he had posted a message saying, "May God and Tanya forgive me." So she called the police after seeing that. Police made contact with John, but the boys were not with him. When they entered the home, they saw the house was in complete disarray. And obviously the boys weren't there. John told the police initially that the boys were with friends and then changed his story by saying he had given the boys to a woman he had met online named Joanne Taylor. He said he had an email relationship with this woman, and the reason he did this was because he was planning on taking his own life and didn't want the boys there when he did. So he told police he attempted this after the boys were gone. The Joanne story was one of several he would go on to tell over the years, and he didn't have an address or phone number for Joanne and couldn't tell police if she lived in the state of Michigan or not. Just obviously very shaky from the beginning. So he was put in the hospital for mental health treatment, and the search for the boys began. They issued an Amber Alert, but police obviously did not buy this Joanne story. The search started fast and furious, as you can imagine. And at the time, the president for the National Center for Missing and Exploited Children gave a statistic and said that 60% of children in abduction cases were recovered safely. But also on the flip side of that, abductors who kill children do so within 3 hours of taking them. That is a terrifying statistic. John's phone pinged in his hometown where the boys were last seen in the early hours of November 26, which was Black Friday. At 4:29 a.m., he pinged about 3 miles from his home. And then around 5 a.m., he pinged near Holiday City, Ohio. And John was very familiar with this area as a truck driver. And the area was also a place where he had spent time with Tanya. And it was apparently a special place for them. And police were told this through talking with family and friends of the couple. The phone was then shut off or the battery died. So I've read conflicting times, but between 6:34 and 6:45 a.m., the phone pinged back at his home. The distance to and from the location in Ohio where the phone went off and the home that he shared with the boys that weekend was about 30 minutes each way. So investigators seemed really certain that the area in Ohio would be where they would find the remains of the boys. So crews searched the locations, and they said that he pinged at and also other evidence that led them there. And they searched along this Ohio highway where John's blue minivan had actually been spotted that Thursday or Friday. They searched buildings, hotels, dumpsters in the area. There's a lot of farmland and back roads. It's not a very heavy populated area. And the investigators called the area they searched a needle in a haystack. So once back home, John was on his cell phone sending text messages and packed up belongings of his and gave it to a family member who lived close by, telling the family member he wanted certain people to have certain things of his. The phone was off for an hour and a half, as we know, when it went offline and pinged back. So investigators feel certain this is the time frame where he likely disposed of the boys' bodies, somewhere between there and his home. In the days after the disappearance, the search for Joanne turned up nothing, obviously, and police said nothing in their investigation showed there was ever a relationship with this person or any proof that she even existed. So after receiving information that John's phone had pinged off of a cell tower near a place called Lazy River Resort Campground, they searched that area, which was closed for the winter, but there were some trailers in there parked. Nothing was found. Tanya went inside the home of John with investigators, and like I said, the house was in total disarray. Glasses were busted. The curio cabinet was busted, as well as everything that was inside the curio cabinet. And the cords to the appliances were cut, and they said there really wasn't anything usable in the house. One investigator who went in with her saw the scene and knew the story that John was telling authorities just did not add up. Something had happened in this house. Search history on his computer included killing with rat poison and breaking someone's neck with your hands. When asked about this, John said that he and the boys were watching a movie the night that they were last seen. And there was a specific scene in the movie where where a character slips and breaks their neck. And the boys were curious about this. He said that was why that search was on his computer. And then later, John admitted that he lied to authorities about Joanne, but then said he gave the boys to an underground group. And one he named as United Foster Outreach, as well as a group called Underground Sanctuaries. But investigators showed neither one of those existed, and no group has ever come forward claiming that this was a real group or that it's true that he gave the boys to them. John said he was trying to keep the boys out of harm's way due to Tanya's criminal sexual conduct charge, and also claimed to authorities she was abusing the boys. She said she was interrogated. All of her things were searched. Investigation happened. They interviewed everybody from church leaders, school leaders, teachers, administrators of the school, family, friends, and that was unfounded. So eventually the Michigan State Police and the FBI came on board the investigation. There were sightings at flea markets and a woman who matched the description of another sighting at a donut shop in Sandusky. But investigators weren't so hopeful that the sightings were credible and instead thought that the focus really should be on where he would have disposed of the bodies. The tips would come in and law enforcement would quickly follow up with them, only to find, as we know, in cases like this, they're not credible. Despite their effort to track down and exhaust every lead, nothing came from any of the tips that were submitted. At the same time, authorities really weren't sure if John had given the boys to someone or a group. It was still kind of a possibility since she hadn't found bodies. There were theories that the boys may have been given to someone in the Amish community. And local members of the Amish community who talked to reporters, which is kind of rare because Amish do not like to be on camera, said it was unlikely that the boys would show up in the Amish community and not be suspicious because they say they do keep up with current events. So the boys likely would have been recognized as missing if they were in that community. So the Amish are not as disconnected as we thought. And this is a really small area, by the way. This is really a small town. It's not a huge metropolitan area. So word travels. And this was such a big case that it's definitely spread throughout the Amish community. They knew of the boys when asked by the reporters. So John was arrested on November 29th, 2010 for kidnapping related to not returning the boys to their mother. And The FBI took him into custody after he was released from the hospital following his mental health treatment that was related to him saying he tried to harm himself. He was held on a $30 million bond. The top left picture here on YouTube is a photo taken shortly after his arrest. And then we just have a couple of through the years. And so his parents visited him via video for 30 minutes at the jail shortly after his arrest. And he told them the boys were safe and sound and asked his parents to share that information. His parents were convinced the boys were still alive and well, and that John was protecting the boys from their mother, although John would not tell his family where they were. So ultimately, the prosecutors dropped the 3 kidnapping charges, which carried a life sentence each, by the way, in exchange for a plea deal where he pled no contest to unlawful imprisonment. No contest is where you don't say you're not guilty, but that way you can be sentenced. Tanya spoke at the sentencing, asking for the maximum punishment. She said, not 1 minute of the day for the past 9 months, 2 weeks, and 6 days have the boys been from my thoughts. I worry about them. Are they safe, warm, being fed, and most importantly, being loved? My fear is that the answer to these questions are no, because no one will ever be able to love those 3 precious boys like I do. She said, I take comfort in the fact as a Christian, wherever my sons are, God is watching, loving, and protecting them for me. She asked the judge not allow John to be eligible for any early release. She said Alexander and Tanner were excited to play soccer, and Andrew was going to play football for the first time, and seeing their friends go to the practices that the boys would have been going to, it made her sad that they were not there to enjoy that experience. John also spoke at his sentencing saying, I do love my boys. I don't think there's been a day I haven't cried at least once or twice. I looked at their pictures all the time. All right, I do love my boys. I don't think there's been a day that I haven't cried at least once or twice. I look at their pictures all the time. I would have done things differently if the system didn't fail me. The prosecutor said his actions disrespect the lives of his sons, and the only real question today is whether Skelton is man enough to finally stand up and finally tell the truth so the mother knows what actually happened. And they said, will he do that, or will he continue in his cowardly ways? The state also pointed out if they thought the boys were being abused, he could have gone to police, his attorneys, or to protective services. So on September 15th, 2011, nearly 10 months after the boys went missing, John was sentenced to 10 to 15 years in prison. And the average sentence for the unlawful imprisonment charge was 4 to 12 years, but the judge told John it was grossly inadequate and chose the stricter penalty. John's attorneys objected to that stiff sentence, saying that there was no cause for the judge to exceed the guidelines, and there was nothing here to conclude that a person was injured or killed, saying, my client is not here on a murder charge. His attorneys also said that John regretted giving the boys away, and he believes the group will return the boys once they're older, saying that he wants to see his kids as well. So the judge called his version of events ridiculous and chastised him for putting the boy's mother, and the community through agony, saying, for months, I've asked you to return Andrew, Alexander, and Tanner. You've refused to answer me truthfully. I've asked you to tell me where the children are located, and you have refused, telling one conflicting story after another to explain their circumstances since they were last seen. Your explanations have been ridiculous, a bit more sad than anything else. John later said in years past that he pled no contest, avoiding a potential life sentence for those kidnapping charges in the hopes that he would be out and would be able to see his sons again. In interviews later on, John's mother said she thought about people saying there's no way the boys haven't found the internet or a phone after all these years. And she said, did anyone ever think maybe the boys are happy where they are? John's sister says she has researched cases where over 100 children were being hidden in these underground networks for their protection. Years later, John's father said at one point he was pumping gas and someone came up behind him asking him not to turn around, but said, I know where the boys are at and they're okay. His dad said, thank you, and that was it. He didn't turn around to see who was speaking to him. So John's family feels the FBI mistreated John from the beginning, and his mom told WDIV that they would bring him to court with no clothes on, which was a suicide gown. If you've ever seen those, a defendant being brought into a hearing where they have kind of no shirt on and it's kind of a sleeveless thing that velcros, that's for his own protection, especially since he claims that he tried to harm himself. She said the boys are okay, and she can say this because she has a grandmother's heart. But his mom and dad still 100% believe that he gave the boys to a group and that they're safe and okay. She said the boys are victims, not in the sense that we think of victims, but that they've missed out on two grandparents and a father and an aunt who loves them dearly. She kind of stops and says, I'm sure Tanya loves them too. She said everyone's a victim in one way or another. So years later, after John had been in jail, he sent a letter to a reporter saying that he was in segregation for 4 years. He put the reporter on his visitors list and they went to visit him. He spoke with her for over 2 hours. He shook her hand, started crying, said he was shocked he was interacting with a visitor. He told her he missed the boys and said he was a good dad and would have never hurt the boys. He said he already had made arrangements with a group called the Underground Sanctuary. And at 10 p.m. on Thanksgiving night, a van came and 2 women and a man came to take the boys away. The variation of the story over time included names of Elijah and Sue, and that John was driving the van. John was not driving the van. He also told investigators he wrapped the boys up in a blanket and gave them a stuffed animal before they drove off. He told the boys they were going to have a better life with an Amish family in Ohio on the Indiana border who had let them ride on a tractor and buy these farm boots the boys had been wanting. John cried and said that he regretted giving the boys away to the reporter. He specifically named the Underground Sanctuary as the group who took the boys. And so the podcast that they did locally, Shattered, interviewed a former reality star whose name was specifically put into the boys' disappearance. I remember this guy because I watched the show Amish in the City. So Mose Gingrich was on this show, Amish in the City, from 2004, that followed Amish youth during Rumspringa, which is where they can go out and experience the world before they commit to joining the Amish church. He left the Amish community and established years later an underground network where Amish kids who were choosing to leave the community would be taken in by him and his wife, and they would help them get established in the outside world with things like getting their first car, getting jobs lined up, a place to live. What's interesting is John specifically named the Underground Sanctuary as the group who the boys took, although Mose, whose name was brought into this specifically by John, said he never called it that. And what's interesting is Mose says in 2012, there was a show about the underground operation that he had with his wife. It's likely that John saw this show because it would have been considered educational and then worked this into his alibi about his own sons. So the police asked Mose to talk to John. So he went in and he said that John was caught completely off guard by his visit. He said it was clear John recognized him and was right there in front of him. And he said, instead of John saying he saw Mose on a TV show, Mose said John was very, very quick to say someone had given him a photo of Mose at some point. Mose said he couldn't believe how smooth John was about that. So essentially, Mose called him out on his lying. He said, you told authorities the boys were given to me, and Mose told him he never saw his boys and didn't know of the boys actually until a few months prior to the visit, which was years later and long after they went missing. John apparently started acting like he was mind blown and started crying and said, that was my last hope. I was told I could contact you after my parole and see my boys. But Mose has done his own research and asked John when he told the organization, when he was told the organization that allegedly Mose headed up had found him. And John said of November 2010. But what Mose didn't tell John is that his show about this underground network for Amish kids leaving did not debut until spring of 2012. Mose later recalled to the Shattered podcast that John was very collected and intelligent, and you couldn't get him to slip up on his story. Mose said over the course of an hour, John became more relaxed talking to him. So Mose slipped something in very slyly and asked John if he had heard of the name Cephas Yoder. And John kind of stopped and collected himself. And Mose said it was clear that John was sort of coming back to not being so relaxed with him. So Cephas Yoder was a popular kid who was featured, an Amish kid who was featured on the show Amish Out of Order. While the show was being filmed, Cephas actually was killed in a car accident, and that was featured on one of the episodes, which Mose, as we know, suspects John watched in prison. He said John walked himself back, but Mose knew by his reaction that he knew who Cephas was, and the interview could have ended right there for Mose because he essentially knew John was full of it. He said he thinks that John has lied so much over the years, it's almost like he believes the lies that he's been telling. So what do we know about John? Well, he's still in prison, and he was actually denied parole in 2020. He did not show up for the parole hearing last year in 2021, and he was again denied parole this year in 2022. He can reapply next year for parole, and if he doesn't make it, his release date is 2025. Kind of walking back, December 14th, 2017, human bones and teeth were found at a vacant home in Missoula, Montana, and anthropologists used the teeth to determine initially that the remains belonged to children aged 2 to 4, 5 to 8, and 6 to 10 at the time of death, which was close enough for Michigan police to kind of weigh in on that. I want to throw up here an age progression as we finish this episode of the boys, because you never know. Unfortunately, I think we know what happened to the boys in a general sense. It's been so many years, but still. When they looked to see if the remains they found were connected to the boys, in the end, they weren't a match. And the remains were actually found to be possibly more than 100 years old, and the youngest child was likely Native American. On the 10-year anniversary of their disappearance, investigators told people who hunt in the woods to be on the lookout for anything related to kids, such as clothing or toys. And investigators say they have not given up hope that one day the Skelton brothers will be found. Their mother told WDIV that they will be together again. She said it may not be until she's buried, but she will find them. She said the age progression photos are the hardest for her because she still sees them at the ages they were when they went missing. And it should be noted that John has not been charged in connection with the boys' deaths. So it's kind of scary to think that these boys' disappearance and likely murders will not be punished. I think it would be awesome to see a big kind of reinvestigation from the beginning of this case where they go in and can start with fresh eyes and fresh minds to see if maybe there's something there, or some kind of elaborate searches, where they have drones now that they can fly over areas. And I don't know how it relates 12 years later, but sometimes these drones can detect disturbed ground where graves have been dug. I don't know. I just feel like with him potentially getting out in 3 years, maybe it would be amazing to see this investigation kind of reignited and get some resolution so that if he did kill his boys, which unfortunately I think that's probably going to be the case, that he does not get out of prison. But anyway, so that is kind of a good summary, I guess, of the Skelton brothers. But it's an intriguing case in that 12 years, no answers, really. It's like they just disappeared into thin air. So I will keep an update for you. Like I say, this is one of those cases that pops in the news about once a year, mostly locally. Very seldom now do I see anything nationally about it, but I do highly recommend that Shattered podcast. I haven't had time to listen to all 10 episodes, but what I have listened to is very well done. And they have a lot of insider information from friends and family because they're local to the case. I'm going to link that in the description. As usual, any pictures used during this will be put in a link in the description. So, all right, guys. Well, I hope you have a good rest of your day. If anything breaks in the other cases we're covering, I'll hop on and do a really quick episode. Haven't looked at anything lately, so I know there's been nothing major, but I haven't looked for anything really small in the University of Idaho murders or Shanquella Robinson, those cases that we've been following. Carrie Allen, I do know there has been an arrest warrant issued for the man whose house they searched. Don't think they've got him into custody yet. But have a good afternoon, and we'll see you tomorrow.